What happens when a nation's most brilliant warrior becomes its greatest liability? When a man indispensable to winning a war commits an act so inexcusable it threatens to tear the entire cause apart. This is the story of two titans of the Second World War, old friends turned into judge and accused, and the secret words one would be forced to write to the other when a moral line was crossed in the unforgiving crucible of combat. It is a story of fury, friendship, and the brutal calculus of command, where the fate of millions can hang on a single, private letter. In the immense, sprawling conflict of World War II, few figures loomed as large as Dwight D. Eisenhower and George S. Patton. They had been friends for over 2 decades, drawn together after the First Great War by a shared, almost fanatical belief in the future of tank warfare. Patton, the wealthy, flamboyant aristocrat from a long line of soldiers, and Eisenhower, the steady, self-effacing son of a poor Midwestern family, were polar opposites in nearly every way. Patton strutted while Eisenhower walked. Patton cursed while Eisenhower charmed. Yet, they saw in each other a complementary genius. Patton, ever the romantic, believed wars were won by sheer audacity and inspired leadership on the battlefield. Eisenhower, the pragmatist, understood that modern war was a colossal undertaking of logistics, politics, and coalition management. For years, their careers were intertwined, with the senior and more famous Patton often mentoring the quietly ambitious Eisenhower. When Ike attended the prestigious Command and General Staff College, he studied using Patton's own detailed notes to guide him. But by 1943, history had inverted their roles. Eisenhower, the master strategist and diplomat, had been elevated to supreme Allied commander, the steady hand holding a massive international coalition together, while Patton was his most brilliant and most explosive general on the ground. Eisenhower knew he needed Patton's fire to win the war, but he also knew that fire, left unchecked, could burn down everything he was trying to build. And on the sun-scorched island of Sicily, that fire was about to erupt. If this epic tale of clashing legacies and the burdens of leadership has already captured your imagination, ensure you are subscribed to our channel and press the like button. We invite you to share this story with someone who needs to hear this profound lesson in history. And let us know in the comments below what part of this legendary rivalry you find most compelling. The story begins in July of 1943. After the hard-won Allied victory in North Africa, the next logical step was the invasion of Europe itself, starting with what Winston Churchill famously called its soft underbelly, Italy. The first move was Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. It was a monumental undertaking, the largest amphibious operation of the war to date, involving over 150,000 troops, thousands of ships, and a complex command structure under the overall authority of General Eisenhower, operating from his headquarters in Algiers. Leading the American ground forces, the U.S. 7th Army, was Lieutenant General George S. Patton. His counterpart, leading the British 8th Army, was the famously cautious and methodical General Bernard Montgomery. From the outset, the plan was a source of friction. The strategy, largely influenced by Montgomery, tasked the British with the main effort, a direct thrust up the eastern coast to the crucial port city of Messina. Patton's 7th Army was assigned the less glamorous, but vital, role of landing on the southern coast, protecting the British flank and securing captured airfields. To a man like Patton, who believed his destiny was to lead heroic charges and who harbored a deep personal and professional rivalry with Montgomery, this was an insult. He saw it as a supporting role, a leash on his aggressive instincts. The landings on July 10th, 1943, were a success, though a chaotic summer storm nearly jeopardized the airborne drops the night before. Allied forces quickly established a beachhead against initially light resistance. But as Montgomery's advance northward along the eastern coast began to slow against stiffening German defenses, the tension between the Allied generals reached a breaking point. The operational plan called for Patton to stay linked to the British flank, but Old Blood and Guts, as he was known, saw an opportunity. He chafed at the restraint, privately fuming that he was being held back. On July 17th, He flew to Allied headquarters and argued for his army to be let loose. What happened next became a defining moment of the campaign. In a stunning act of high-stakes insubordination, Patton made a unilateral decision. He split his army. While a portion continued to cover Montgomery's flank as ordered, he created a provisional corps and personally led a lightning-fast 100-mile drive west to capture the Sicilian capital, Palermo. He deliberately obscured the move from his superiors, at one point famously claiming a crucial countermanding order from his direct commander, General Harold Alexander, had been garbled in transmission. The drive was a spectacular success. Moving with incredible speed, his armored columns sliced through light Italian defenses, covering vast distances in mere days and taking tens of thousands of prisoners. On July 22nd, the U.S. 7th Army triumphantly entered Palermo. The victory made headlines back home, cementing Patton's public image as America's most daring general. But in Algiers, Eisenhower was incandescent with rage. Patton hadn't just bent the rules. He had risked the entire campaign on a play for personal glory, stretching his supply lines dangerously thin and acting in open defiance of the Allied command structure. Eisenhower's reprimand was delivered swiftly and, crucially, in private. He recognized the military success but condemned the insubordination. Patton was now on an extremely short leash, and the air between the old friends was thick with unspoken tension. This explosive act of defiance was the tremor before the earthquake, a warning of the untamed ambition that Eisenhower would soon be forced to confront head-on. While Patton was racing Montgomery to Messina, a different kind of war was being fought in the rear echelons, a quiet, desperate struggle against the invisible wounds of combat. Field hospitals were filling with soldiers suffering from what was then vaguely termed battle fatigue or shell shock. Today, we would recognize it as post-traumatic stress disorder, a severe psychological injury caused by the intense horror and stress of warfare. But in the 1940s, the understanding of this condition was tragically limited. To a commander like George S. Patton, it was simply cowardice. In his fiercely black-and-white worldview, a soldier's duty was to fight and to die if necessary. Physical wounds were honorable scars of battle. A mental breakdown, however, was a moral failing. He saw these men not as patients, but as skulkers and malingerers who were shirking their duty and weakening the army. His diary was filled with contempt for them, at one point writing, "If they shirk their duty, they should be tried for cowardice and shot." On August 3, 1943, this deeply held conviction collided with reality. Patton, ever the hands-on commander, decided to visit the 15th Evacuation Hospital to see the wounded. He moved through the sweltering hospital tents, offering words of encouragement to men with physical injuries, until he came upon Private Charles H. Cole. The soldier was sitting on his cot, showing no visible wounds. He was suffering from a high fever and what doctors had diagnosed as exhaustion. Patton's high, cutting voice sliced through the quiet of the ward. "What's the matter with you?" he demanded. The terrified young private looked up at the towering general, with his polished helmet and famous ivory-handled pistols, and mumbled, "I guess I can't take it." That was the spark that lit the fuse. Patton's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "You're just a goddamn coward," he screamed, his voice echoing through the tent. In a shocking explosion of fury, he slapped Private Cole across the face with his gloves. He violently berated the sick soldier, calling him a yellow bastard and ordering him back to the front lines before being ushered away by the hospital's commander. It wasn't an isolated incident. The storm inside Patton was still raging a week later. On August 10th, he visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. There, he encountered Private Paul G. Bennett, an artilleryman who was visibly trembling, weeping on his cot, and suffering from acute anxiety. "It's my nerves, sir," Bennett sobbed. "I can't stand the shelling anymore." Patton exploded again, this time with even greater violence. "Your nerves, hell," he bellowed. "You are just a goddamn coward." He struck Bennett hard across the face, the blow knocking the private's helmet liner from his head. Then, In an act that horrified every witness, Patton unholstered one of his iconic pistols. Shaking with rage, he brandished the weapon at the terrified soldier. "You ought to be lined up against a wall and shot," he snarled. "In fact, I ought to shoot you myself right now. God damn you." He struck Bennett a second time before the hospital's commanding officer, Colonel Donald Currier, physically stepped between the general and the weeping private, pleading with Patton to stop. This was no longer just a flash of temper. It was a clear pattern of abuse. Word spread like wildfire among the appalled medical staff and the soldiers in the ranks. Formal reports were filed, detailing the general's shocking behavior. Those reports began their inexorable journey up the chain of command, destined for the desk in Algiers belonging to the one-man Patton both deeply respected and profoundly feared, the supreme Allied commander, Dwight D. Eisenhower. When the official reports landed on Eisenhower's desk, they placed him in an impossible, agonizing position. He knew Patton's volatile temper better than anyone. He had known about it for 20 years, and had defended his friend and subordinate time and again, even to the Army Chief of Staff, General George C. Marshall. But this was different. This wasn't a reckless strategic gamble or a boastful quote to the press. This was a disgusting and systematic abuse of power directed at sick and helpless soldiers under his care. It was a fundamental violation of the bond between a commander and his men. The crisis deepened as the story began to leak beyond the confines of the military. A group of disgusted war correspondents, having heard the accounts from horrified doctors and nurses, decided to act. They confronted Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, with an ultimatum: fire Patton, or they would break the story to the world. Eisenhower personally met with the reporters. He did not deny the events, but he refused their demand. Instead, he appealed to their patriotism, asking them to suppress the story not for Patton's sake, but for the sake of the war effort. He argued that Patton, despite his flaws, was indispensable to the war effort, a guarantor of our victory. Reluctantly, the correspondents agreed to hold the story, but the secret was now a ticking time bomb. Thousands of miles away in the United States, an influential and deeply feared radio columnist named Drew Pearson, known for his aggressive investigative journalism, was already catching wind of the rumors and beginning to dig. Eisenhower felt the immense weight of his command settle upon him. He was utterly alone in this decision. Firing Patton would mean losing his most aggressive, effective, and feared combat commander right on the eve of the critical invasion of mainland Italy. It would be a gift to the German High Command. Yet, keeping him meant implicitly condoning an indefensible act. It risked a catastrophic scandal that could shatter the morale of the entire U.S. Army and fatally undermine public support for the war at home. The professional fate of General George S. Patton, old blood and guts, now rested entirely in the hands of his old friend, Ike. The time for friendly advice and private reprimands was over. The Supreme Commander was about to pass judgment, and his decision would echo through history. What would you do if you were in Eisenhower's shoes, forced to choose between loyalty, morality, and the cold logic of war? Let us know your thoughts in the comment section below, and if this deep dive into the complexities of leadership is holding your attention, be sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with a history enthusiast you know. On August 17, 1943, after days of deliberation, Eisenhower finally acted. He did not summon Patton to Algiers for a face-to-face shouting match. He chose a colder, more formal, and far more powerful method: a secret, personal letter sent by courier. It was a masterpiece of controlled fury, each word carefully chosen for maximum impact. I am well aware of the fact that firm and drastic measures are at times necessary to secure the desired objectives, Eisenhower began, giving a slight nod to Patton's hard-charging philosophy. But the acknowledgement was immediately followed by the hammer blow. But this does not excuse brutality, abuse of the sick, nor exhibition of uncontrollable temper in front of subordinates. The words were surgical and devastating: brutality, abuse of the sick, uncontrollable temper. Eisenhower was making it clear this was not about tactics or military discipline. It was a profound moral condemnation from one general to another. He reminded Patton that his insubordination during the Palermo campaign was already a matter of grave concern, but this behavior was far worse. These acts, he wrote, were damaging to your reputation and to your prestige as a leader, and despicable. He stated unequivocally that if the facts as reported were true, he would have to seriously question your good judgment and your self-discipline, which would, in turn, raise serious doubts in my mind as to your future usefulness. Then came the sentence. Eisenhower made a calculated decision. There would be no formal investigation, a move that would have made the incidents public and inevitably forced him to fire Patton. Instead, the punishment was to be a deep and personal humiliation, one perfectly designed for the proudest general in the United States Army. Patton was ordered to apologize. Personally, he had to seek out Private Cole and Private Bennett and apologize to them. He had to apologize to the doctors and nurses who had witnessed his behavior. And then he was ordered to appear before all the officers of his corps, division by division, to publicly express his regret. Eisenhower's letter ended with a chilling, unambiguous warning. This was Patton's absolute last chance. I will not, he wrote, again be put in the position of covering up for you. One more misstep of any kind, and his career would be over. In a separate, private note to General Marshall in Washington, Eisenhower was brutally honest, writing that Patton continues to exhibit some of those unfortunate traits of which you and I have always known. For Patton, the letter was a shattering blow. He felt, in his own words, as though he had been crucified unjustly. But he was, above all, a soldier. He obeyed the orders of his superior officer. He found both privates and delivered his apologies. Then came the tour of atonement. Standing before his assembled officers, men who revered him, he began to offer his mandated apologies. In one famous moment, as he started to speak to the men of the 3rd Infantry Division, they sensed what was happening. A chant rose from the ranks. No, General, no, no, as they tried to stop him from humbling himself. Witnesses reported that tears were streaming down Patton's face before he was overcome with emotion and had to walk off the stage. But the loyalty of his men could not save him from the public storm that was about to break. In November 1943, the columnist Drew Pearson, having confirmed the details, broke the story on his national radio show. The scandal was immense. Congress erupted, and newspapers screamed for Patton's dismissal. Although many Americans defended the tough-talking general, the political pressure was unbearable. Quietly, Patton was relieved of command of the 7th Army. As the Allies planned the most important operation of the war, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy, General Omar Bradley, who had once served under Patton, was chosen to lead the American ground forces. Patton was sent to the sidelines, a general without an army, his legendary career seemingly in ruins. For nearly a year, as the war raged on in Italy, General George S. Patton became a ghost. Benched and disgraced, he was a man of action with no action to take. But Dwight Eisenhower was playing a much longer game. He had not fired Patton. He had put him on ice. Now, as the Allies prepared for the invasion of France, Eisenhower was about to use his disgraced friend as the ultimate weapon of deception. The plan was called Operation Fortitude, the most elaborate and critical deception campaign of the entire war. Its goal was to convince the German High Command that the main Allied invasion would strike at the Pas de Calais, the closest point across the English Channel, and not at the beaches of Normandy. To sell this monumental lie, the Allies created a phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG. It was an army that existed only on paper, brought to life by a symphony of inflatable tanks, dummy landing craft, and torrents of fake radio chatter. But a ghost army needed a commander, and to be convincing, it had to be the one general the Germans respected and feared above all others. They simply could not imagine a full-scale invasion of Europe without George S. Patton at the tip of the spear. So, Patton was made the highly visible commander of this phantom force, ostentatiously touring England, inspecting his non-existent troops, and allowing German intelligence to track his every public move. The ruse worked to perfection. Hitler and his generals became utterly convinced that Normandy was a feint and that Patton's real army would land at Calais. Even after the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, Hitler kept critical panzer divisions in reserve near Calais, waiting for an attack that would never come. By benching his most famous warrior, Eisenhower had saved countless Allied lives on the beaches of Normandy. Yet even then, Patton's mouth nearly ended his career for good. During a speech at a Welcome Club opening in Knutsford, England, he made some off-the-cuff remarks, stating it was the evident destiny of the British and Americans, and of course the Russians, to rule the world. The press, however, largely omitted the mention of the Russians, creating a diplomatic firestorm that suggested an Anglo-American plot to dominate the post-war world. An apoplectic Eisenhower dashed off another furious letter. I have warned you time and again against your impulsiveness in action and speech. If you are again guilty of any indiscretion, I will relieve you instantly from your command. Finally, in August 1944, Patton was given his shot at redemption. He was given command of the U.S. Third Army, which was now active in France. What followed was one of the most astonishing campaigns in modern military history. Unleashed at last, Patton's army became a thunderbolt, smashing through German lines and racing across France with a speed and ferocity that stunned both the enemy and his allies. But his finest hour came that winter during the Battle of the Bulge, when a massive German counteroffensive caught the Allies by surprise and surrounded the heroic 101st Airborne Division at the vital crossroads town of Bastogne. Eisenhower held an emergency meeting with his top generals. He asked them how long it would take to disengage, turn their armies 90 degrees, and launch a counterattack to relieve the besieged town. Other generals said a week, perhaps more. Patton, who had already anticipated such a move and had his staff secretly preparing for it, calmly replied, I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The other generals in the room scoffed. Such a maneuver was considered impossible. But he did it. In a logistical and operational miracle, the Third Army disengaged from its front, pivoted, and battled its way through horrific winter weather to break the siege of Bastogne. It was a turning point in the battle, and a stunning, undeniable vindication of Eisenhower's long and painful faith in his most difficult general. After Germany surrendered in May 1945, the mission in Europe changed overnight. The goal was no longer to win a war, but to win the peace. Eisenhower became the military governor of the American-occupied zone of Germany, a position requiring immense political and diplomatic skill. Patton was made the military governor of Bavaria. The new job required tact, patience, and political subtlety, 3 qualities Patton had never possessed. His primary task was to enforce the Allied policy of denazification, a sweeping order to remove all former members of the Nazi Party from positions of public administration and influence. Patton privately thought the policy was idiotic. He argued that most Germans had been forced to join the party to survive, and that removing every single one would paralyze the country's ability to govern and rebuild itself. He worried it would leave Germany vulnerable to what he now saw as the true enemy on the horizon, the Soviet Union. Predictably, and for the final time, his mouth sealed his fate. During a press conference in September 1945, a reporter pressed him on his slow implementation of the denazification policy. Frustrated, Patton made a disastrously clumsy and politically toxic comparison. He said that the political squabbles between different German parties were really no different than a typical election fight between the Democrats and Republicans back home. The press seized on the quote. Headlines across the world screamed, Patton says Nazis are just like Democrats and Republicans. For Eisenhower, this was the final, irrevocable straw. He had defended Patton from his rivals, disciplined him for his abuses, and saved his career for the good of the war. But this was a direct, public contradiction of official Allied policy in the fragile, volatile, post-war world. The diplomat could no longer afford the warrior. On October 7, 1945, Eisenhower summoned his old friend to his headquarters and, face-to-face, relieved him of command of the glorious Third Army he had led across Europe. Patton was reassigned to command the 15th Army, a unit that existed only on paper, tasked with the mundane job of writing a history of the war, the ultimate insult for a man who lived only for action. Just over 2 months later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was struck by a U.S. Army truck at a slow-speed railroad crossing. The warrior who had survived the bullets and shells of 2 world wars suffered a broken neck and was paralyzed. He died in a hospital bed 12 days later. What Eisenhower said when Patton crossed the line was, in the end, far more than just words in a letter. It was the climax of a long and complex relationship between 2 American titans who held profoundly opposing philosophies of leadership and war. In that single, secret document, Eisenhower performed the ultimate balancing act. He unequivocally condemned the man's inexcusable brutality, yet he masterfully saved the general's military genius for a war that still hung in the balance. He enforced a crucial moral standard within his command, while simultaneously making the brutal, cold-eyed calculation that Patton's unique brand of aggression would, in the final ledger of war, save more lives than it cost. In his memoirs, Eisenhower defended his controversial decision, arguing that keeping Patton in the field measurably shortened the war. The story of their conflict reveals the crushing loneliness of supreme command, where a leader must sometimes find a way to harness and direct forces of nature that he cannot ever hope to fully control. In that moment of judgment, Eisenhower didn't just discipline a subordinate. He balanced the fate of the war on the tip of a pen, with words that proved to be as sharp and as necessary as any sword. As this story of crossed lines and unbreakable wills concludes, we ask you to subscribe for more untold chapters from history's most consequential figures. Please like this video if you found it compelling, share it with someone who needs this lesson in leadership, and let us know in the comments. What detail from this story did you find the most surprising or interesting?